My name is Brian. I'm Operations Supervisor of Cinema St. Louis, and Cinema St. Louis is the presenter of the 30th Annual Whitaker St. Louis International Film Festival. I'd like to thank you and welcome you to this seminar on BIPOC documentary filmmaking. I'm going to turn things over to tech entrepreneur, a filmmaker in his own right, and a board member of Cinema St. Louis, Srikant Chellappa. Srikant is also involved in the Chellappa Vedabaling Foundation, which is underwriting all of our masterclasses and seminars at this year's film festival. Sri?
Hi, well, thanks, Brian, and thanks everybody for having me on this panel. I'm really excited to be on this panel today. This is a topic that I actually learned about recently, so shame on me, but BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, and People of Color docs. Very interesting topic. We always talk about, Black docs or alternate docs, but I like the fact that we've combined all of this into one construct, which we are paying attention to in this festival. And we have some amazing filmmakers on the panel to talk about their documentaries and in general, also talk about what BIPOC docs, past, present, and future looks like and where they should go and learn more about it, right? So with that, I'm going to start basically a short introduction about myself. My name is Sri Chellappa. I'm the board member of Cinema St. Louis. I'm also a filmmaker. I've done a couple of documentaries and a few feature films that have gone out to different film festivals and Netflix and Prime and the likes of those as well. With that, I'm gonna go ahead and let each of the panelists introduce themselves briefly with their name and what their area of documentary is, and they'll talk a little bit about their work. And we'll go around the room. So I'll start with you, Natalie.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here today. So my name is Natalie Patello. I am a writer, producer, and director. And this is the film that is at the festival right now is the first film I have ever worked on, first feature length. So yeah, it's called And So I Stayed. It's a feature length documentary about survivors of abuse who are unjustly incarcerated for killing their abusers in self-defense. So it took about 6 years to get to this point. But yeah, so I came into it sort of as a journalist in grad school, and then yeah, a friend of mine who did the documentary program at Columbia was like, would you like to make a documentary out of your master's thesis? So here I am today, now a quote unquote filmmaker, which I'm still, I don't know, the imposter syndrome never goes away, I guess, is what I hear, but I'm gonna own it today and say that, yes, I am a filmmaker. But yeah, that's who I am, and that's what I've been working on. Perfect,
thanks, Natalie. And if you make a film, you're a filmmaker. For here on out, for the rest of your life, you're a filmmaker now. I totally understand the imposter syndrome, because for a while I used to struggle with that, and then I'm like, we had 7 films at this point. I can't be a filmmaker. So Debbie, do you want to go ahead next?
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, it's like being in AA. It's like making films. So my name is Debbie Lum. I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you, Cinema St. Louis. And it's such an impressive gathering of filmmakers that I'm very honored to be speaking here with you all. I have been making documentaries. I'm very old. I've been making them for a long time. My film that, and I should note that I've always made films that either worked on or directed and produced myself, films about the Asian American experience, the AAPI community, and have been waiting patiently for the market to catch up. My film that's in the St. Louis Film Festival is called Tryharder. It premiered at Sundance this year, and it follows 5 students at the top-ranked public high school in San Francisco, California, as they try to get into the elite college of their dreams. And it's a majority Asian American high school. The film very much looks at the intersection of education, race, and mental health, which is a really important topic today. And yeah, that's about
Well,
it.
thanks, Debbie. Yeah, we'll definitely talk a little bit more about that. John, do you want to give a quick introduction next?
Yeah, great. Hey, thank you so much for having me here. It's wonderful. This is a wonderful experience. And I'm John Valadez. I produce documentary, direct, write, produce documentary films. I've done that for about 25 years. I've produced feature-length documentaries for primetime national broadcast on PBS. On a pretty regular basis. And I was also a producer for CNN and did documentaries for them for a while. The film that I have in the festival is called American Exile. It just received a national broadcast on PBS on, well, last week, November 16th. I guess. And it's about two brothers who volunteered and fought in Vietnam, highly decorated. And then 50 years after the war, they are being deported. And they discover that there are thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of US military personnel who are kicked out of the country after they complete their combat service in the US military. Yeah, but that's about it. And I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, Sri.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's a wonderful introduction and a great documentary. I look forward to seeing it. Mobalaj, do you want to give a quick introduction, calling in from your almost nighttime in London or Cambridge, I should say?
It's always nighttime. I think it gets dark at 4, right? It's 7. But my name is Mobalaj Olambiwanu, and I am the director and producer of Ferguson Rises. Ferguson Rises focuses on how the community was impacted by the killing of Michael Brown Jr. in Ferguson, but more specifically focuses on the father and his journey toward finding purpose in his pain. So looking at black masculinity and grieving, looking at masculinity and grieving, looking at how they're, the depiction of Black men and using the film as a platform to humanize Black men, to humanize fathers, and to really look at how people ultimately find purpose in their pain. So that's this is my first feature-length documentary, although I've worked in the industry for many years in various capacities for other people. I decided when my wife was pregnant with our child, that someday in the future he was going to ask me what I did at this historical moment when Michael Brown was killed, and I did not want the answer to be that I did nothing. So I made this film for my son, to honor my son and to give him a sense of how to find resilience and purpose in his pain, and by extension, giving the rest of the world that sense as well, as it relates to the trauma around police violence.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mobalaj. Obviously very important subject. It's a subject that's been talked about, fought for decades now, and keeps resurfacing every few years, and I'm sure it'll keep resurfacing, and that's the unfortunate part to some extent. So when we think about these different topics, obviously, there's the Black, there's the Indigenous people, and there's the people of color, which includes, people of, I guess, brown color like me, but also Asians and other Latinos as well. I guess it's an open question, and anybody can jump in. Why is BIPOC as a category of documentaries important compared to the entire spectrum of documentaries out there? Like, what is it about having a special focus on BIPOC that you feel is necessary at this time?
I can jump in just in terms of my limited experience and working in the industry as a person of color. I mean, I found that that traditionally the documentary field seems to be predominantly white, at least everywhere I've been in LA, where I live. All the meetings, I'm usually the only Black person in the room, or maybe one of 2 Black people in the room, and it might be me and my cinematographer who's also Black. So it might just be the 2 people that know each other in the room, and there might be one Asian face, one Latin, 1 or 2, whatever. But the diversity factor is very limited. Documentary is not you know, not a big money maker. And I think because of the amount of, for me at least, because of the need to invest so much in it, and, you know, via either personal funds or grants or whatever, and the difficulty in making it, I guess maybe for a lot of people of color, they don't see the payoff necessarily financially for making documentaries, so they go into narrative, you know, or television or whatever, where you can make the most money. And so I find that we don't have the amount of diversity in the field of documentary that we could have, based on, you know, the financial support that's offered or the lack thereof, and also based on just how I think white the field really is. And I think documentary in some ways for me has not really fully caught up with what's going on in feature films, where in feature films they're beginning to question whether or not a film about a woman should actually be directed by a woman. Whereas in documentary, I see a lot of, you know, white people directing Black stories, directing Asian stories, directing what, you know, I'm not seeing that sense of consciousness in the documentary field that says, hey, you know, maybe it might be good to have a woman tell a story about a woman, and maybe she might actually bring something that a white man wouldn't bring to, you know, to this story about Latinx, you know, women or whatever else. I think the consciousness is just not, has not really reached the documentary branch. There's a lot of rich, sort of elitist mindset type folks who believe that they seriously can tell a three-dimensional story about people of color. And some of them I think are very good, but again, they lack that the depth of perspective that comes with you know, people of color telling the story about themselves, or women telling the story about themselves. And I think unfortunately, the need for forums like this or conversations like this comes from the lack of representation and the need to support one another in this field. And so it's just great to see these faces and to hear about your documentaries. I'm really excited when I see people of color in the documentary field, because again, I just don't see as many, and maybe I'm not in the right places. I don't know what the right places are, but at least in Los Angeles, I'm not seeing that representation. I'm not even seeing, like I mentioned, the desire to have that representation it hasn't quite bubbled to the top in the way that you know, narrative filmmaking has sort of shifted in the face of the pushback, you know.
Yeah. Natalie, you know, as you are looking at, you know, your films, now I know yours was more focused around domestic violence. Did you also take a more people of color angle in your film, or was it more focused on women in general?
Yeah, it was focused. So it's, I mean, a documentary, like, right, like it evolves because there's like more people that are touched by the issue, and you learn about them. But there is a Black woman who's a survivor in the film, and that was a very conscious decision to make sure that we contextualize the issue not only of domestic violence, but of an incarceration, and showing that criminalization happens at a far more frequent rate to women of color, Black women, more than their white counterparts. So yeah, throughout the filmmaking process, I mean, even in the reporting, you can see how in the courtroom misogyny leaks in these cases. And then when, you know, we looked at Tanisha's case, it's very clear that there was not only misogyny, but racism. You know, statements like, maybe she's violent because, quote, the culture she came from, end quote. And so like that, yeah, I mean, that was pretty blatant in just reporting the issue itself, that we needed to show that. I mean, and also that the police response in these cases, you know, Tanisha's mom said, like, we don't trust the police because they don't do their jobs when we call them. And so, you know, it was important to not only contextualize that, you know, women are usually victimized because of patriarchal violence, but also that that extra layer, that extra barrier to reach safety for Black women and women of color, Indigenous women, is even more because of maybe the neighborhood they happen to live in and the police don't want to go there. So yeah, we definitely explored how race affected these cases in the film and in the reporting.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I obviously come from a South Asian background, which is, even if it's called people of color, I think my experience is fundamentally very different than being an African American or even a Hispanic, for the matter. So I definitely, see when I read about, and and obviously I didn't grow up in the U.S. I know when I read about all these different stories of that were just kind of put under the rug, which kind of makes me wonder, if the reason we need to have more BIPOC documentaries and more awareness of these issues because people don't learn them in school, right? For example, the whole issue that I learned only a year ago about the GI Bill, when GI Bill was given primarily to, white people, I guess. And I don't know how much truth there is in it. I didn't spend a lot of time researching it, but it sounded like if that's big news. How come people don't know about it? That GI Bill was given, but it was focused. It was excluding, Blacks in that area.
Yeah.
Same thing about your documentary, John, for example, about you serve in the army, you are putting your life for your country, or in this case, maybe not your country anymore because you're being kicked out of the country after 30, 40 years, and it's not just a few people. It's not an exception. It seems like the rule when it's in tens of thousands of people or in that range, right? And I think that's the reason I feel my personal opinion is, on these documentaries, it's like re-educating the public about things that they don't learn in school anymore, right? So what is your, and this is, I guess, a broader question to maybe you, Debbie, or John, if you want to jump in. Do you feel BIPOC documentaries is a way of saying, hey, you didn't learn these things in school, so it's maybe you need to learn these things because your textbooks were an alternative or a version of history that was not necessarily the true version of history?
I'd love to jump in there. First of all, I just want to echo what Mobilaji said about representation. I mean, if you're talking about documentaries, I've made documentaries for over 30 years. And the reason why I have made documentaries about Asian Americans is because there was never any other way to have stories about our community get out there without making documentaries, because we were completely shut out of mainstream media. And even about, if you look at, let's say, Scrubs or any like TV show about doctors, are there really ever any Asian American characters in those shows? No, but if you go to the doctor, who's treating you? And this is why it's so important, is because the narrative, it's definitely about representation. Thank you for calling that out. Everyone should check out a podcast called Viewers Like Us by Grace Lee, which came out of the Beyond Inclusion talks about like, why is public television, there's only one voice who tells the story for all of us. And, granted, great mad skills as a filmmaker, but then there's always one dominant narrative, and the rest of the narratives out there are subsumed under that one narrative. And that is why there's a term called BIPOC, which is that anyone who's not white and male is shut out of this of this dominant narrative. It's always been like that. It has to change. And the truth is that, the other reason why BIPOC is such an important term is that the dominant narrative also has managed to divide and conquer, so that, when you look at the representation of people of color and minorities or anybody who's different, LGBTQ, Native American, anyone who's different, we're pitted against each other. And that happens a lot, for example, between Blacks and Asians, for example. And it's around issues that I really don't think it's from within our community. In my film, in Tryharder, that's what it's about. It's about getting into college, and it's about the ways in which students are seeing themselves as like running the gauntlet, like it's the Hunger Games. And if it's Black against Asian or white against Black, and it's really, I don't think that's the reality of how people actually see it themselves, but it's because we don't have the agency to tell those stories from within our community. Sorry about that. Let me turn it off.
No,
Okay.
no, thanks, Debbie.
John, you
Now,
go.
John, you've been making a lot of films in the Latino or Latinx, whatever the right term is these days, area. Could you talk to me a little bit about what has been your experience and why you feel compelled to tell a story in this area of that you feel is maybe underrepresented? And like the story you're talking about, American Exile, I think it's mind blowing, and I think everybody deserves to see it.
Well, yeah, well, documentaries, you know, unless you're Michael Moore, may not be the big money makers, but you know what they are is they are idea makers, and they are national conversation generators. And so there's a very important role in that. The history of documentary film is replete with instances of nonfiction films that have transformed public policy. Okay, so that happens. Yes. But I want to raise the stakes here, Sri. I don't think that this is about I mean, it is about representation, okay? But I want to raise the stakes. I think that this is really about life and death. Okay, it really is.
How's that?
Demographics, it's related because the demographics of the United States are rapidly shifting, okay? The students today across the country who are in elementary school are predominantly people of color. By 2050, we will be a majority minority nation. And by the turn of the next century, we're going to be some iteration of a Latino country. Now, what shape that takes, nobody knows, but we know what the demographics say. And so it's no coincidence that right now, since, you know, the late 90s through, you know, after 9/11, that we've seen the rise of white supremacy from coast to coast. And it's targeted not only LGBTQ folks, but Asian Americans. There's the ongoing violence against African Americans. I mean, we're watching the Arbery case and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And then the ongoing violence against Latinos, of course. And then Native Americans, geez, do I even have to go there? And as the demographics change, some portion of the white population begins to feel a sense of dis-ease over those changes, and it's causing a lot of friction. And the reason why people of color making films is so important is because our films become ways of spanning divides of difference and finding new connections for positive change and understanding, because films create empathy and an understanding of the context in which other people live. And then we can understand one another's humanity, as well as all the other things, you know, social forces, history, legislation, politics, all of that. But you know, American Exile is important because those veterans being deported are almost all people of color. They're from the global South or from Asia or Africa. And they are kind of a canary in the coal mine. If you can deport people of color veterans who have always had a special status in American life, well, that kind of opens the door for what you can do to other people. You know, think of the kids in cages along the border and the families that were separated and may never find their children again. It really is life or death, not only of us as individuals, but as a national project for what America means. Is whiteness the baseline for what it means to be American, and everybody else is American in name only? Or are we truly going to evolve and become the thing which we have always said we were, which is e pluribus unum? From many, we shall become one, right? So I think the stakes are enormously high. I actually think they're like in the stratosphere at this moment.
Right. No, I agree. I think, like I was saying earlier, it's the awareness and education that's missing as you go through schools and look at mainstream media, because all these stories that you hear, that you read or hear are told from the white perspective in many ways. And there are certain references to things like, historical things like, Tale of Tears, for example, or slavery, which obviously there's a lot of references to that. But once you get past some of those bigger, banner areas, there are a lot of undercurrent of ongoing stories that are not being told anywhere. One that comes to my mind also in the, and this is something that whether it's CNN or Fox or any of those mainstream media, everybody's guilty of this really badly, in my opinion, is this whole epidemic, and I would call it epidemic, of Black girls missing. There's, 10, I don't know the exact number, but there are tens and thousands of them are missing, but that doesn't make the news. A white girl or white guy goes missing in, South America or Italy. Now that's a reality show that's watched by 20 million people. So that's, I think, is the issue. I feel, how do you solve that? I mean, making the documentaries you're making are extremely obviously valuable and important, but how do we get that narrative changed where it's not, where there are these bigger stories that need to be given a more wider audience? How do we fix that?
Well, I think John had the mic drop comment there. E pluribus unum is I'm laughing because I haven't even thought about e pluribus unum in a long time, which just goes to your point that we forget that the thesis or what America is based on is this seeming this mythology of unity, right? And yet we're not at all at that place in our evolution as a country. But I think I'm struck by that more than anything else. But can you re-ask the question again?
Yeah, I guess my question is, there are all these important stories, right? Debbie just posted a comment here about the Japanese internment camps and how Japanese fought for the US in the World War II and were stripped of their rights. And so there's stories like this in every decade, right, across different communities that are not told in schools. So BIPOC, I'm saying is BIPOC is an important way of telling these stories, but how do we make that mainstream? Because even all these lovely stories that we need to hear and see are not going to be the ones that are going to show widely on a CNN or forget Fox, but any of the other major outlets, and then become part of the mainstream education. So what is the solution here?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think I'm in both the documentary and the narrative realm as well, because I think in the fictional narrative realm, I think you have an opportunity to reach a broader audience. So I tend to want to dabble in both areas. I think for me, documentary is about really connecting people to real people, to human, to the humanity of the subjects. And I think in that way, documentary is just really powerful because that the people on screen are real people versus actors. And at the same time, there's a box office draw with actors, right? If Daniel Daniel Kaluuya is playing the Michael Brown Sr. in my movie, whatever about it, people are going to watch that, sometimes more than they watch, the real Michael Brown, Sr., which is the irony of everything. I think there's a balance. I mean, I think we have to find ways, perhaps, and we're seeing this happen more in documentary now, but find more innovative and more creative ways of telling our stories that are also much more visual, much more, sort of akin to maybe perhaps feature films in ways that draw audiences in. I think also part of the job is also just re-educating people, right? We don't have to, we shouldn't necessarily have to chase the feature film aesthetic to provide people with the information that they need. So there's sort of two mindsets and two different ways of approaching it. But I think what we're seeing is a new interest in documentary film now, or the emergence of a greater interest in documentary films, I should say, now than before. And I think having BIPOC people represented in that field then allows us to sort of to take part in that re-emergence or the the wave of interest in documentary films. So it's imperative that we're here. It's imperative, as John said, it is a life or death issue, and it was certainly for me when I made Ferguson Rises. When I saw Michael Brown Jr. on the ground, I saw my son. You know, I saw myself. I saw people that are very close to me, and it was a life or death issue because it became about representing Black male humanity in a way that honored Black men as being individuals who have three-dimensional existences beyond just the rap videos or the sports, whatever the field of sports and entertainment. There is another side to these people that are often maligned in the society. So I think so that's my approach to it, at least.
Right. And Debbie, Natalie, either of you want to jump in on your perspective on how do we make this more pervasive?
I've thought about this many times for decades, and I think what we really need from within our community are producers. It's really about, I think if you are within our industry, producers often get a bad name, and I'm actually the worst producer out there. So I can say that, it is a very, very difficult job. And it's the people in, we tend to sort of, as filmmakers, think that directors and writers are the ones that are making, telling the stories, but actually without the producers, it doesn't happen. And it's really, it's challenging actually to find producers. The producers are the ones that are the gatekeepers, really, of what's being told. And right now there's kind of a gold rush happening in documentaries, with all the streaming content and the endless doc series out there. But the makers and the producers have more power than they have been. Right now, I think they have more power than they have ever had historically, and it's really time to just take that by the reins. My film is going to be released theatrically in 2 weeks, and it's really the first. And we're not doing it. We have a distributor who's putting it in, many markets where it's showing 5 times a day, and we need to get people to go to, in New York, San Francisco, LA, and other markets to actually show up. And I think in previous times, it might have been like, there is no way that would ever happen. But it's actually a really exciting time for people of color, for BIPOC lovers of film and makers, because people are activated. It's like, I think we're all finally starting to see like a glimpse of a chance to actually have some agency, and not be waiting in the wings patiently for our turn. And like, we just all, that's why BIPOC is so important for us all to kind of come together to do this together, because we've really been shut out of it. And anyway, Natalie, what do you think?
I think that's such a good point about, again, this is my first film, but I think it's such a good point about reaching those communities and audiences. I do feel a sense of like, I am, I don't know, I'm able to, because people are activated about these issues. Like, I keep seeing like tweets about, unfortunately, like Rittenhouse, and then make people actually having the conscious awareness to be like, wait, what about, survivors or survivors of color who are incarcerated forever for self-defense or for, crimes that their abusers commit. So I am seeing like a reckoning happening, at least in, within, I don't know, maybe it's my own bubbles. But I think what I'm learning through this sort of, we're doing impact production on our own. I think it's good to learn for your first film. At least I'm feeling that sense. But I think that everyone's point about a lack of funding in the space, I think it's forgotten the distribution part and the audience build and the impact work that we forget that needs to be funded too. Cause like it didn't, you know, we made the film, but like, how are we going to reach the audiences that need to see it the most? And obviously the communities that care about it are going to want to show up, but like, how do you reach, like, how do I reach the judges and the DAs, and then we do, and we're able to fold them into certain community screenings because certain people have connections, but that takes a lot of labor to like reach out to certain people, you know, and pinpoint certain organizations. And I'm glad to be doing that work and learning all about it. I actually really think impact producing is a lot of fun, but it would be nice to have, you know, just like more bandwidth to be able to do the work in a way that felt like it wasn't so like scarce, like everything was so scarce, like, oh my God, we didn't get that one grant. So many people are applying to that one big grant. How are we going to get this funded? How are we going to, you know, and we're still actively looking for distribution. Yeah, we did get a piece in the Times, which interestingly, it was me pitching the journalist, you know, and targeting her because I knew that she would be interested, but it is sort of exhausting. I am finding to just like get the film out there to the people that need the education and need the accountability. I think there are, for what I understand, it seems that there's more funding, but it was in such a, again, like scarce place that it will take a lot to get to the point where, you know, BIPOC filmmakers can feel like there's abundance and that they're able to do what they really want to do with these films, outside of just, you know, production and post and okay, hope to God, you know, like someone picks it up, or that you have enough funds to, yeah, I think that scarcity is like really real, and it's definitely exhausting. And I almost am always am like, okay, putting my 2 weeks in, I'll never make another film again because I cannot imagine the insurmountable labor of doing another thing for the next 7 years. But that's to your point about producers. It's like we were, you know, I and my co-director were also producers, and you just play so many roles, and that's the norm when you first start in independent filmmaking, and it's not sustainable. I don't think.
Well, John, you've been doing this for a while. What would your advice be for upcoming BIPOC filmmakers and in general, you know, getting your film out there?
Look, I mean, I think there are some practical strategies that we can take advantage of that actually, that we can make work in our favor. Okay, so what are some of those strategies? I mean, the first one is that, you know, we need to work together. Okay, so if you're making a film about a particular subject area and you know another filmmaker who did something similar 10 years ago, maybe you should be in touch in terms of, you know, common funders, in terms of audience base, in terms of connections. The other thing is as we move forward in our careers, remember, we get asked, you know, sometimes, right, to be judges on film festival panels or to be on a panel that gives out money for grants or for a production license agreement. And so we need to be advocates for the idea that it's important to have diverse voices that are competing in the media pool, and that we bring with us that argument and that value wherever we go, and that we stand up for it. Another strategy is, I call it coattails. You know, find a filmmaker of color or not, who you admire their work, who you think would be interested in what you're doing, and see if you can get them on as an advisor or an executive producer, or to just look at your cut. And then we can hire each other. Okay, all of these strategies have been things that I've, you know, been fortunate to use. I've had many filmmakers who are very experienced who have kind of taken me under their wing and that I go to for advice and all of that kind of stuff. And so we have tremendous resources within each other that we can, you know, network and build upon. The last thing I'll mention, which is probably a reflection of me being a half glass full kind of guy, which is that, you know, the very fact that there are so few people of color filmmakers in the documentary realm means that there is a scarcity, which is horrible. But it also means that that scarcity is something of value, that we have a value proposition that we can bring to the viewing audience. We can do things that nobody else can do. And we should recognize that, and we should be screaming about it at the top of our lungs, because no matter what we do, the fight to make your films is gonna be uphill. It's gonna be brutal. It's gonna be a blood sport, and you better have thick skin and be tough as nails and just realize that you're doing battle. So, so reach out to other filmmakers of color who have experience and see if we can lend a helping hand and bring up one another. Okay.
So one thing you mentioned, John, I completely agree with that. I thought about this actually quite a bit as well as a filmmaker and as a producer myself. Like, I'm thinking about as a supply and demand, okay, what kind of films are missing? And I always noticed that there's always a scarcity of, you know, South Asian films set in the US. There's a lot of scarcity of that. And then some of them obviously do pretty well. Same thing about some of the Asian films. By and large, I've felt a big scarcity in the Black films and in Hispanic or South, you know, Hispanic films and or Latino films, if you will. So I guess my larger question really is, to your point, is there truly an imbalance in what the need and hunger is for the audience out there for BIPOC type films, both documentaries and narratives, than the industry would lead us to believe because they're not profitable, that's why they're not funding it? What are your thoughts? And anybody else feel free to jump in on that.
I want to jump in actually on the, before we hit that, I think Debbie brought up a really good point. I think my family is Nigerian and Jamaican, and so so certainly that representation is even less in the documentary field, because we're usually engineers or doctors or things like that, which are considered important in our countries, and not artists. And so what I feel like we need to do is also really begin to have conversations within our communities about the importance of telling our stories, right? That if you don't tell your story, somebody else is going to tell your story for you. And when and in the telling of that, they control your narrative. And I think what now, I was just at a Nigerian organization event where they were giving me an award as a filmmaker, which, I almost cried when they gave me the award, because I didn't think that Nigerians cared about filmmakers. And most of my life, I've grown up thinking, I was like, what, you got what? I'm getting an award? I'm like, how am I getting an award? Nigerians I've never heard anybody mention anything besides my son is a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, usually doctor first. And so I'm like, but I'm seeing a shift, right, happen. And I think, there's that old saying that, until the, what is it, the gazelle or whatever the other animal is, it tells its own story, the lion will always be, the lion will always, whatever, I don't know the story, but you know what I mean? Like, yeah. The lion will always get to tell its own story because the lion survived, right? But the gazelle got eaten. And I feel like so many of us are missing in our community, are missing that point, that someone needs to be the keeper of the heritage, and the keepers of the heritage and the keepers of the story are almost as valuable, if not more valuable in some ways than the other people, because the traditions cannot be maintained and the heritage cannot be passed on if someone is not telling these stories, And I think so, to Debbie's point, I think it's crucial that we have producers and executive producers and folks in our communities that put a substantial amount of money into these stories, because we know about Europe, and everybody goes on vacation to Europe, whatever. I'm here in Europe now, right? And there, so we see Black people, Latinx people, Asian people going on vacation to Europe, and there's no sense that, hey, maybe we should go on vacation to Africa, maybe we should, and that's all based on this narrative that was created around Europe being the most important place in the center of the universe, right? So if we want to see our economies grow, we need a new narrative, right? If we want to see all kinds of things change in our communities, we need new narratives. And if we don't tell those stories, we don't see those shifts in the legacy, in the legacies of our communities without telling those stories or having someone tell those stories. It's money is made based on storytelling. Everything is made, it's shaped by storytelling, whether it's a marketing pitch or whatever else it is, it's all storytelling. And again, we need to be in charge, and we need to invest in those narratives in order to move our communities forward. And so I think for the money people who are the doctors and lawyers, they need to think about, or the financiers or whatever, they need to think about the importance of that, or else we're, and I think that would shift a lot in our communities as well if we shifted our priorities. And that we wouldn't have kids in cages at the border if we had that narrative properly, pushed to have the political, sort of clout behind us to have people see, Latinx children as human beings, for that matter. Would they do that to white children? There's a narrative about white children and a narrative about, white people in general that would never have that be possible,
So if I could do this, Sri, just to throw out a very practical thing that people can do. If you're a person of color, one of the things that you can do is you can make sure that you have robust reception in your own community, and you can use that as a kind of a base to springboard you into, I guess, crossover status. Can I say it that way? So one of the things that I've done over the past 20 years is whenever I make a film, mostly about Latinos, okay, and it goes on public television, what I do is I go on a national screening tour, and it's really to Hispanic serving institutions, to community centers and barrios across the Southwest, museums, etc., in order to reach the Latino market, the Latino audience at a grassroots level. And over time, those become, when I first started, it was like, okay, we'll give you $50 to do a screening, and I'm like, okay, fine, I'll sleep on somebody's couch, right? But then over time, you build up a rapport with those community leaders in Dallas or in El Paso or in Albuquerque or in LA or San Francisco or Portland, whatever. And over time, those become now paying gigs, and you begin to build up a kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say it's not, this is not a rock and roll band, but a kind of a fan base or right. Economic support base for your work. And that came in very handy. I did a film that was distributed by PBS Home Video, and they gave me the cover design for when we had DVDs, right? And it didn't have my name as the director on the front cover. And I came back to them, I said, I want my name on there. And they said, well, we don't do that. So then I went and I looked on the internet and I found Ken Burns' Civil War, right? Or World War II, whatever. And I showed them and they said, well, he's a known director. And I said, well, you know what? Latinos in this country don't know who that guy is. And if you go to Latinos in this country, they know exactly who I am. I am a known director. So you're wrong. And so I became the first person to get my name on the front cover, because I made the argument that white people are not the center of the universe, that people need to reach out to Latinos. And the way to do that is to begin to brand, right, Latino directors, because I've already done the work. I had the community screenings and all of that to kind of prove it. And then I had my films in colleges and universities being taught in Latino studies, ethnic studies programs, American studies programs, Mexican American studies programs across the country. And so then we get into those institutions as part of the core learning system. And then we begin to build our reputation, but we use our own communities as that base, that springboard from which to emerge.
Yeah, great. That's phenomenal. I think, thank you for that.
Yeah, I know in the Indian community, which is the South Asian Indian, not the American Indian, the South Asian Indian community, we do a lot of that, where you would make a movie and you do tours of your South Asian communities in all the burbs of all major cities, and that's how you get your film out there. But going back to my question, which I still want to get an answer on, is there a supply and demand imbalance of the BIPOC films, both in documentaries and narratives, that you feel the executives of these streaming media and, outside of PBS, obviously, and other major networks are just missing out because of their own myopic view of what they think people want?
No doubt. I'll let Debbie or someone else answer that. I could definitely speak to that, but I think John has brought up a good point, which is that ultimately you show them that there's the economic viability by having these thousands of people on your coattails saying, hey, we want more content, because they don't know that there's more content, right? And in my case, I will just say this real briefly. When I made Ferguson Rises, we were going to release this film in 2016, a version of this film in 2016, and then Who Streets came out. And so I was with a major agency at the time, and they were like, oh, Who Streets came out. There's already a film about Ferguson. And I'm like, what? What do you mean there's already a film about Ferguson? That their film is not even related to the same, it's at the same time period, has the same sort of backdrop, but we didn't make the same film. But in their mind, there was one film about Ferguson, even though there's 300 films about World War II. Right. There's one film about Ferguson, and that's it. We told the Black story already. And I remember being at that agency and leaving, and the one Black agent, this huge table for like 100 people, the one Black agent walks out with me, and she says to me, they really like your film, but they're only really going to back one Black film this year. And I'm just going to let you know that. And I was like, what? I was like, is this 1970? If they like my film, they called me in, we had this huge meeting. What do you mean you're only going to back one Black film this year? I'm like, that doesn't, so there isn't that, to John's point, there is still not that understanding that, that, hey, there could actually be many stories told from this particular community. And the way that we force their hand in a way is by having a large group of people, behind us saying, look, I've got, 50,000 viewers already. So you're losing money by not participating in this. And so thank you, John, for reminding me of that, and making it clear that we can create our own groundswell, and then have them, get on board when they get on board, if they get on board as well.
Yeah, and Debbie, it looks like you have a few words to add to this. I'm all ears here.
I'm a little apoplectic, so because when we talk about this, it gets it's really frustrating. That is insane, and I've had the same thing happen to me many times. Even from people who were supporting us. Who said, "Oh, your film. There's another film coming out also about a high school. You're going to compete against them. There's only going to be one that gets in." And actually, as it turns out, and I'm talking about, you have to really keep trying. Like in the title of our film, you have to try harder. We applied, actually in both of my films, the film that I made previously premiered at South by Southwest. This film premiered at Sundance. Tryharder premiered at Sundance, and both times I applied twice, actually. And it was the second time that I got in. And my executive producer who came on, who's also, Jean Chen, an amazing creative producer of documentary, she was like, well, Sundance, I don't know, but they just, changed. They're going through a major change right now, and Tabitha Jackson is now in charge. And clearly she's, really promoting BIPOC filmmaking in a way that is so long overdue. We've got Oscars So White, we've got, we have had Black performers that have created a whole industry from the beginning of our country, and yet they're shut out of, any award ceremony because they're not celebrated. Anyway, I told you I'm unable to express this clearly because it's such an it's so long overdue. I mean, I grew up here in St. Louis. I remember when I was 7 years old, listening to my teachers talk about Martin Luther King and the civil rights era. I thought that was baked into our history. I didn't realize that that's something that we'd be still fighting for to, 60 years later, or okay, I'm not that old, but, what is going on in our world that this is taking so long? We need the audiences to show up. My film, we really hope that Tryharder will be the Crazy Rich Asians of documentaries this year at the box office. If you look at that film and why that went to #1, it's because we did have our community come out, and kudos to the Asian American community that they are putting their money where their mouth is. It's kind of amazing. It's a very, it brings tears to my eyes after having done this for so many years and seeing so many amazing filmmakers not get the recognition and the support that brilliant films that have a huge impact that change the world, but nobody knows who they are, right? But we need that in every single community. And we need to not feel divided. We should all be coming out to see, somebody an angel donor out there who has the means needs to support Natalie and give her all the money that she needs for her impact campaign. Seriously, come on out, reach out to her after this is over. And, the same goes for John and Mobilaji. I mean, and Shri, I'm like, you're a producer, yay, that's amazing. We don't have enough people like that in our community. But it is changing. I mean, you have companies like Macro who are, they're working in both fiction and documentary. You've had these long-standing organizations like Firelight. There's Chicken and Egg for women filmmakers. There's so many different organizations that do exist out there, and everyone should just be supporting them because they bring out the films that you want to see. Okay, I'll stop now.
Yeah,
no, that's great.
Yeah, I think the more that gets out there, the more it'll be seen. And recently we're seeing this phenomenon of South Korean films, or Korean films in general, but primarily South Korean films because there's not a lot of films from North Korea. But anyway, so of coming out, and that's been in Oscars. It's been in the show like the Squid Game, and I've been watching this really interesting Kim's Convenience.
Convenience, yeah.
Phenomenal. Me and my daughter, it's like every Sunday thing. This evening we'll be watching it again. So it's one of those things, and it's really taken off. It's like once you get the spigots out, you realize how much demand there is for certain types of films. And similar thing happened to some extent in South Asian films a few years ago with Monsoon Wedding and some of the other films that came out at that time. And Mindy Kaling and all the other South Asian performers. But I feel like I still feel there's not enough of that's happened in the Latino community or the Black community to some extent. Am I correct in that assessment, or do you think it's just my perspective?
Shri, we live in a racist society. That's the reason. And so, I mean, I guess, at least from my perspective, what I'm always gunning for is just let me compete on a level playing field, because you know what? Most of the time I'm going to win. That's what's going to happen. And I think that's what the fear is that Black people in this country happen to be incredibly talented, just as talented as white people. Wow, revelation. That Asian Americans are every bit as talented and insightful and have the cognitive abilities of their white counterparts. That's part of the fear, because when decision makers come from a very specific community and they have an unconscious bias towards stories that ring familiar to their own experience and touch their own heart because it's what they've grown up with, then they naturally gravitate towards that. I remember early on in my career at public television, and just to be clear, I love PBS. I love them so much. Okay, right. So any criticism is out of okay, seriously. But I remember there would be discussions, and I would pitch a show, an idea to somebody who was a funder within, the system, whatever. And they would say, but that's not a national story. That's a regional story.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And I would say, well, what's a national story? Give me an example. They would say, well, the Boston Tea Party. I said, no, that's regional. That's Boston. What do you mean national? So what people do is they tend to take that whiteness as a baseline, and that becomes the center of gravity for American consciousness, and everything else is seen as peripheral, but that's a perspective that they bring with them.
Yeah.
And so the more we have people who are decision makers, who are more diverse and can see the connections and the ramifications of full participation, because this country was not built by white people, it was built by everybody, then the more that will evolve. But that has to come about because of pressure. And part of the pressure is activism, but part of the pressure is we just got to do damn good work that is just better than the competition.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I look at, one of the things that's, as an independent filmmaker, one of the people that I looked up to and admired, and I don't necessarily love his films, but I just love the way he went about it, was Tyler Perry, right? He went outside the system. He couldn't get the support from the Hollywood, and he went on his own way, making films in Atlanta, and there became big films. You would have thought that would start a trend of films like that, and the institutions investing more in African American and Black films, but that didn't happen. Why is that? And I don't know if any of you have real answers to that, because I would think, as an industry, a for-profit industry, they would focus where the money is, right? Because obviously there's a demand for Tyler Perry films. His films are okay, not my cup of tea, but I like funny films, and sometimes his films are funny and sometimes they fall flat for me, but he found success in the community, and obviously that was not replicated at a scale that I would have anticipated.
Yeah. I was like, I don't know. I think it's about representation, but it's about looking where the money is, but it's also about controlling the narrative. And I think fundamentally underneath it all, for people, it's not always about the money. I used to think it was, but I was like, if it's about the money, Roots was the most successful miniseries of all time in 1977. And they made nothing after that,
right.
For another 20 years. So clearly they saw where the money was, but they chose not to go in that direction, because I think racism certainly supersedes capitalism in some ways. But I think going back to what John said, I think there is a window here in which we can, through our hard work and through our determination, that we can prove that the system works, right, or that the system can work for us, right. That's why I'm in London, right, or in the UK, because when I talk to distributors for my film internationally, they were like, "Oh, that's an American story. That's a regional story." I'm like, "It's a father who lost his son. People don't lose their sons in Greece. They don't lose their sons in, they may not lose them exactly this way, but people all across the world are dealing with pain, or dealing with loss, are dealing with police brutality in India, or why would this not be an international story?" Right. And they couldn't give me a reasonable answer, so I'm over here to prove that it's an international story. I'm like, what they're talking about is BS, And so, I'm raising my impact funds as well, to make sure that I can screen this film internationally. There are communities that I'm here in Cambridge right now, and they came out sort of crying after the screening because they identified with, and these were some, a lot of them white members of the community here in Cambridge, and they identified with the story as fathers, as people, as human beings, right? So, our stories are essentially about human beings, and I think Hollywood needs to stop seeing them as Black or Asian or whatever else, and start seeing them as stories about real people. And the only way that they're going to do that is if we set up the structures, and put them in place, so people, by building the communities that John mentioned earlier, where people realize that, wait a second, these people are making money, and we can either be in on it, or we can be on the outside. but they're going to make money without us, so we might as well try to jump in and be a part of it. And I think that's ultimately what gets them on board.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to go around the room and just ask a couple of quick questions, then each of you can help answer. So question number one, what are some of the other BIPOC stories that you wish somebody would tell? Because obviously there's a lot out there that people haven't told, like, for example, I was talking about, the Black girls missing and the Japanese internment camps. There's hundreds of such stories, but those are two that came to my mind, and Debbie reminded me of that one too. And second, where do people can go and see your films and other BIPOC films in general? So I will start with you, Natalie.
Sure. Yeah, in terms of other BIPOC stories that should be told, I mean, there's so many. There are so many that are untold on the big screen that are playing out in real life. I personally would love to look into and I think people have done this, but I personally, my next thing maybe is looking into those who are incarcerated and are pregnant and the type of care that they receive. And I know that there's doula programs, which doula, anyway, that has the cultural context there is that BIPOC people created that sort of caretaking role. And so it's really cool to see it come inside of prison. So yeah, so that's where, maybe I'm going, I don't know, we'll see. And, but yeah, I think anyone can think of stories and I think I see a lot of things that are classified as documentary that are like true crime. And I'm really tired of seeing that. And so I think maybe, steer away if you're gonna do a story about the criminal legal system. There's like this false equivalence that keeps happening where this is what the prosecutor said and this is what the defense said, and sometimes there's not an equivalence that needs to be like, you don't need to hear from the DA necessarily because they got it wrong. So I don't know. So I'm just sort of like, if there is a filmmaker out there who is thinking about covering the criminal legal system, just know that there are many nuances and to uncover other than the he said, she said. But yeah, I find, yeah, and then you can find my film, well, I don't know where next, to be honest, TBD. We're still in the film festival circuit. We're doing some community screenings, so you can find out more by visiting our website, which is andsoistayedfilm.com, and we keep posting stuff that comes up at screenings that come up. But
can you say your name of your film again and the website again if you want to spell
sure, it's andsoistayedfilm.com.
And so I stayed.com.
Yeah.
No, film.com.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Natalie. Debbie?
Just like Natalie, ditto. There's endless numbers of films that should be told, if you just go for the majors, if you're talking about AAPI, right? There's like, we're Asian Americans have been here for 300 years. We've been in all aspects of, just like from the railroads to, to the Nobel, prize winning scientists and doctors, and nobody knows it at all, right? It's just like completely buried. Like long before Brown versus Board of Education, there was the Mamie Tate court case, or there was the, birthrights, which is the birthrights citizenship. That was a court case that was fought by someone Chinese American. And yet if you look at the last year, 2020, and the rise of anti-Asian violence and hate crimes because of this, the previous administration's name for COVID-19, this is not something new. These are the waves of anti-Asian violence, and these storylines are not new. They just haven't been told. And the reason why they keep cycling over and over again is because The people who look like us on the screen don't have their stories told. Our narratives are not being told. And as John said, this is a life or death issue. If the shooter at the Atlanta spa, you know, over the summer, saw Asian women as real human beings and not as a sexual fetish, that, you know, those women would be alive today. And if you think about it, what was their life like for all the 365 days of the year leading up to that shooting? We don't know because nobody tells that story, you know? Okay, so as far as watching our stories, you know, our stories are everywhere. We're on, like, you know, as John said, we're all over PBS. PBS tends to be one platform where, you know, there is more, you can see more films by diverse filmmakers at a certain time period, really late in the evening. if your station will broadcast it, which, like, my film, you know, Seeking Asian Female, was also on public television on Independent Lens, and actually Tryharder, if you can wait until May of 2022, kicking off AAPI Heritage Month, along with Ferguson Rising, which was just on Independent Lens, it will be on Independent Lens again. And then, but we are, as I mentioned already, Tryharder is being released in movie theaters in San Francisco, Berkeley, New York, Los Angeles, San Rafael, many other markets. And actually, depending on how we do during this opening weekend, we will open in more markets. It might go to Sugar Land, Texas, or it might go to Washington, D.C., or it might go to Chicago or St. Louis, you know, and it really depends on whether people will come out and put their money where their mouth is and support our stories. So you can find out more, tryharderfilm.com, #tryharderfilm. We're out there, connect with us, and do the same for all the filmmakers here.
Thank you, Debbie. Hey, John.
Yeah, you know, I don't know how to answer your questions exactly. You know,
I think the first thing that comes to your mind, this story needs to be told, you know.
Well, here's the first thing that comes to my mind is I was thinking about the 1619 project, and I was thinking, well, what's the Latino equivalent? You know, maybe the 1848 project.
The 1492 project.
Well, there's that too. I mean, you know, so, you know, I mean, I guess the whole idea of reframing consciousness and using cinema as a vehicle to see the world from a different vantage point is such a beautiful artifact of our era, you know, and the fact that we are at this inflection point of demographic change, which is permanently going to alter and it is permanently altering the nature of, you know, of who we are as a nation, is so critical. It's so dangerous, and it's so ripe with opportunity. Think about this. This is what I think about. I think about the fact that I'm not going to be on this earth, you know, for that much longer. Human lifespan is so short, right? But the films we make, what ends up happening is we're actually creating, we're lobbing these little time capsules into the future, so that 20, 50, 100, 1,000 years from now, people will know that we were there fighting to try to make this country true to its highest ideals and most noble aspirations, that we never gave up on the American project of plurality and diversity and community, this revolutionary idea that people from all over the world can come together and be united in principles of freedom and democracy, and kind of, you know, with a lot of fits and starts and a lot of screw ups, quite frankly, but in the long run can maybe make it work. As I've looked through, I've made a lot of historical films about the Latino experience, and I got to tell you, we are absent. There's so few images of us because no one was filming us in the 1920s, or the 1930s, the 1940s, or even the 1950s. And so if there's no image of you, if your story is not uttered, then you become a phantom of history. You become a ghost. You become the undead. You know, you didn't exist. And so what we're doing is we are creating the record, not just for our own time, but for all time. And think of what kind of a resource that is for young people after we have turned to dust.
Right, right. Because they're not in the textbooks, right? And that's great.
Well, they will be.
They will be.
because once the evidence is there, once the films are there, once those films are taught in colleges and universities, then they slowly proliferate and seep into, the groundwater, and over time it becomes undeniable, right? And it's a cumulative effort. It's not about Latinos. It's not about African American. It's about all of us supporting and helping one another. So don't be afraid to reach out to other filmmakers and make those connections, because you may be in a position as a filmmaker, you may have a producing question. And somebody else may have been to that festival, or somebody else may have gotten funding from HBO, or somebody else may have worked with Netflix. And that's how we proliferate the constitution of knowledge within our own multiracial community.
Right.
So we need to use that resource.
Agreed. Thank you, John.
You didn't say where to see your film, John.
It's streaming on, it just aired on PBS. It's streaming free for the next 30 days. And then after that, you can pay money. But this is what's really going to happen, or at least my view, is I'm getting the films, all my films are getting in colleges and universities. Okay, there they become part of a permanent archive at, say, Notre Dame or the University of Chicago or UT Arlington, whatever, and then they become part of the common memory of those institutions, and that is enduring over time.
I'm inspired. We should have ended with you, John. I was like, I don't have much to say after that, other than I'm grateful, one, that we're having these conversations. I think this conversation is of the utmost importance. And as far as films that or stories that need to be told, I think stories need to be told where we're subject, not object in the story. And I feel like the white gaze often has us as object in the story, right? So we're often not three-dimensional. We're often not the vantage point through which the story is told. We're somehow this thing that's in a way in the way of progress, or in the way of the protagonist, or something that the protagonist needs to pass through, right, in order to get to where they need to get to, right? Or sort of this plot point along the way. And I think we need to tell stories where we are subject, where we are the vantage point through which the story is told and experienced in a way that humanizes us. I mean, I have many stories in mind that I want to tell. I think even just the civil rights movement, as we talked about, the backlash against critical race theory now is actually a good indication that things are moving forward. Like there's only that backlash when things are actually moving forward. So maybe we need to tell stories, continue to tell our stories, so there can continue to be backlash because they see things moving forward and they're reacting accordingly. Ferguson Rises, as Debbie said, is on Independent Lens. We will be on Amazon Prime as well. So we should eventually, so we should probably talk with each other about SVOD. So if you need any help with that, as well, Natalie, and we should all maybe help you if you're not there yet as well. I would hope to get all your emails. I think they're in the chain, and communicate with you all outside of this. And I think, as John said, I think that is going to be what's going to help us. This is my first rodeo. I happen to be one of the lucky ones that on my first rodeo got distribution and got all this stuff that took place, which I'm thoroughly grateful for, and we want to help make sure that everybody else has the same experience during their first rodeos as well. And I will say this one last thing, which is that most of my investors in my film were individual investors. I had to do I'm going to curse here, I was a shitload of crowdfunding. But we were able to raise somewhere over $100,000, dollars in crowdfunding across 2 crowdfunding campaigns. So I sort of became this sort of expert crowdfunding person without intending to be that. And I think what I got was from that whole process is really talking to people in our communities about legacy, and I think that speaks to what John was talking about. What is the legacy that you are going to leave for your children, right? This is very much about my son making this film, but it's also about other people's children and the legacy that we're going to leave. And I think if we begin to talk about filmmaking in the context of legacy, in the context of creating the future that you want your children to live into, that you want all of us to live into, then I think we have a shot at expanding the resources that we have access to and the people that we have access to when we talk about it in that sort of, in that sort of framework where it becomes about these greater themes, not just about Asian Americans, right? Not just about Michael Brown Sr. It's about finding purpose in your pain, right? We have to speak about it, I think, in a way that everybody can identify with it, whether or not they're African American or Asian American. We have to speak about it in that way. And I think when you do frame it in that way, people can jump on board because they see it not as a singular experience, but as this shared experience that we all can participate in.
Awesome. Well, there's a question here from Emilia. Is there going to be a screening of Ferguson Rises in London as well?
Oh, there's someone from London? No, the BFI didn't see fit to screen the film, so I'm gonna besmirch their reputation here by honestly say, yeah, they for some reason they didn't. They asked me to send them a screener, and then proceeded not to accept me when they were the ones who actually screened it. So I have no idea what their logic was behind that, but it will probably screen in London, in that I have relatives there, and then I'm going to figure out a way to create these, as John talked about, those community screenings that are necessary, because the idea that Ferguson or that Black Lives Matter is not a global idea is ludicrous, since millions of people protested all across the world, in Korea and Japan, where they don't even have large representations of Black people, Sweden. In my mind, I'm like, how is some distributor telling me that this is not an international issue when if you look at the footage, there are millions of people who protested all across the world.
Absolutely.
There's just a lot of insanity anyway. So it'll be showing in London at some point, even if the BFI did not see fit to do that. So long answer.
Great. Is there anything that I missed before we wrap up that you guys want to add anything to this discussion or the conversation?
I can throw, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Debbie.
Oh, no. It is a really simple thing. It's just, we're talking about it as if BIPOC is different from everyone, and I actually think that white audiences want diversity too.
Right.
Or, everyone is tired of the same old narrative, and women's stories, we're tired of not, women not being women being the object and not the subject as, of our films. And yeah, that's it. I actually think it is, what we're all saying here is that BIPOC filmmaking is universal. All of us sitting here have walked in the shoes of, Brad Pitt for most of our lives. So I think it's possible for Brad Pitt to walk in the shoes of other people who don't look like him, just like we have. And yeah, I think everybody wants that. But I'm not as eloquent as John and Mamaji. So go preach the knowledge, please, John.
You're great. Professor John is
Okay. Debbie, you've had the ability to endure over time and continue to make work. So, and you're on Independent Lens, so not too shabby, my friend. That's success. But I wanted to say this. It's like every filmmaker's career is different, so there's no template for survival, let alone success or how to thrive. There's no one path. And so everybody has to invent their own way through the wilderness. But one of the things you can do is you can take strategies that others use and then adapt them if they seem appropriate. And I just wanted to throw out one of the, I mean, I've mentioned a bunch of strategies, I hope, but another one is that, you know, I studied film, I went to film school, and I noticed that my professors were working filmmakers. So they taught and they made films. I had a professor named Sam Pollard, who was one of the producers of Eyes on the Prize and has edited many of Spike Lee's films and has directed many films. You know, and so there's also a model that you can do if your spouse is not a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, and if you don't have family trust money, which a lot of independent filmmakers do. And if you're not making money through commercials or other means, you know, having a teaching gig can provide that kind of financial stability and a springboard for you to do your own work. I'm a professor at Michigan State University, and I'm the director of the documentary film program. So that provides a, you know, a kind of an economic base, you know, for my work. So that's just another strategy that people might want to think about. And the more professors of color we have teaching filmmaking, well, you can just see the influence and how that grows.
Definitely.
And you were able to get your students to work on your film, I think is what you told me as well, right? So
oh yeah. I brought students to work, you know, as production assistants. I brought students to Mexico, California, Colorado, Arizona, Illinois, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. So talk about a great internship working on a film for primetime national television. You know, we as people of color, we got stuff to offer here that is precious, man. We are gold. We are golden. So be proud of the work that you're doing and let it shine, because what you're going to realize is that people, it's going to be a rough road, you know, but people, friends and allies will arise when you thought you had not.
Yeah.
True.
There you go.
All right, so there's one last question. So I'll give each of you 30 seconds for this. What is your next project, if you're willing to share that?
This impact campaign, getting this film out. So I feel like that's, again, to the point of like not, yeah, that's its own project, the making and the creating, but yeah, getting this out into the DA's offices, the judges that need to see it. That's my next thing. And then maybe a short about what I spoke about earlier, incarcerated folks who are pregnant.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you.
Well, I can't say. Because I don't have, you know, part of what filmmakers need to do is we need to secure rock solid access. And so there's a period of time when we're figuring things out, and something may happen or may not. And, you know, and if you start talking about stuff, you might be putting the cart before the horse situation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll speak in general terms because I agree with John on that one. If I haven't secured access and I speak about it too early, then it might be all for naught. But I would say, I mean, I'm interested in stories that you know, emphasize the humanity of African Americans, that really focus on bringing that to the foreground, that show us as vulnerable, sensitive human beings primarily, because I think that is an understanding that America doesn't have of us. As you know, they have an understanding of so many other things, but not the vulnerability, the sensitivity, the humanity that really touches people's hearts. You know, my commitment is to, ultimately with every film, I would say from this point forward is to make people cry. Really, that's I want people to be so touched and moved by the humanity of the subjects that they cry, because I think change comes through tears, through that kind of human connection. I think people are then able we're able to leverage those tears into something that really builds social change. And in the absence of that, I think you don't break through that hard exterior that often keeps people separate.
Thank you. Mobile. Debbie, do you have any projects that you're working on that you want to talk about?
And I just want to first say it's so exciting to be talking with you guys. You guys are totally inspiring me. And I feel so much of a shared mission sitting in this room with you. Yeah, again, access, I'll keep it simple. I'm working on a film that takes place in St. Louis in a beloved institution with diverse young people, children. I'm excited about that, but I can't, again, it's hard to talk about it. I'm based in San Francisco, California. And when I started making Tryharder, it was actually originally about tiger moms, the whole stereotype of Asian moms who push hard to exceed at all costs, push their kids to exceed academically at all costs. And, in doing the research, I hear there's a lot of Nigerian and Jamaican moms that are just like that. Oh, yeah. So, and of all backgrounds. So that my Tiger Mom project is sort of evolving into another film about moms, a doc series about moms in schools. Also, I got into documentary wanting to do fiction, which we all do, and, I'm working on some fiction as well. But again, it's hard to talk about it. And just like Natalie, our film has an impact campaign. So if you actually go and check it out, our campaign really strives to recenter students at the heart of college admissions through mental health and DEI, which is so important these days. It's like to keep your sanity while you're trying to do well in life. Yeah, that's it.
Well, thanks, Debbie. Well, thank you everyone so much. This has been a wonderful panel. I learned a lot myself. Like I said a week ago, I didn't even know the term BIPOC. Now I do. And I am absolutely excited about this. I haven't made a film in about 5 years now. It's been a while since I've been focusing on my tech startup. I am now thinking about making or helping one of you guys make a movie, or any of the other filmmakers out there. It's been very inspiring for me as well, and I know it's been inspiring for all the viewers out there. And this will live on YouTube, so obviously they'll have a long tail of people who can learn and become better filmmakers, and also learn about this whole topic of how to tell better stories where you are the subject and not the object. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Could I say one thing? I forgot to mention, everybody mentioned their website. I forgot to mention you can also follow us at fergusonrises.com. So I know, and I don't know if John mentioned his website, but I know everybody else did. So maybe you want to plug your website too, John.
AmericanExileFilm.com.
Excellent. Thanks. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.